Yeah.
That is
amazing.
Yeah, I don't think I could. I need way more stimulus.
Yes.
I need at least to see people who I should tune out.
Gotcha.
That would be better for my level of mental health. I imagine if you're doing that for a job, waiting for your daily coffee customer in that peaceful, tranquil, untroubled environment, I imagine you're, I don't know, writing a lot of dark poetry. That's what I'd be thinking.
Yeah. It may well be contested as well as to whether it's the most isolated. Sarah in Port Chalmers writes, I think the coffee cart at the old Clifton Bridge between Tuatapere and Blackmount might be more remote. Joyce definitely makes the best coffee between Riverton and Te Anau. So you never know what might be the most isolated coffee cup. Big response to the last piece on lowering the voting age. Genevieve says, I'm an art teacher and I hear students talking about current issues and see the ideas they express through visual art. I am all for 16-year-olds voting. They are underestimated and way more clued up than some of my peer group are. Another one here, though, says, I'm a 15-year-old and I believe that 16-year-olds should not be given the right to vote as we are too young. Most of us will base our vote off popularity or who we see on social media the most or who our friends like. We won't actually read about it. That's just too much effort for us. Also, no one that I know at my school has mentioned this. So, various points of view there. A lot more on that. We'll tuck some into the next Friday's mailbag. But finally, on a brief note, if you live in the city, this next story might resonate. A Hamilton resident has shared a note from a neighbour that was left on their car. It reads in part, quote, please do not park outside our house. We are a small, quiet street. When we have visitors call in sometimes, it would be nice if they could park outside our own property. Perhaps you could work out a plan in front of where you live. The person who had this note left on their car lives on the street and had parked just one house down from their property because of the roadworks. So is it fair enough to leave a note? Do you, Raven, can park your car every now and then outside your neighbour's house?
I can kind of relate to this. Like there is this notion of that little bit of footpath outside. You do feel like someone's just a little bit close to you if their car is right there. But I guess it's very hard tone-wise to write a note and leave it on anyone's windshield that comes across well.
Sally?
Yeah, I mean, we all have the right to our street, so I don't think you should. But I tell you, during COVID, I got a wee bit grumpy, but I didn't express it because I live in a one-way street, and right outside, as Rabin says, there's a little pavement, and there's a one-way street and a commercial van. The man down the road who's got a commercial van parallel parked it right out the front. And so two wheels are on the pavement and two. So I know exactly what he sells because this big van was parked out there for the whole last corona outbreak.
It'll be about getting the tone of that note.
I didn't leave him a note.
Yeah.
I didn't leave him a note.
Hard to write that note. Anyway, what a wonderful panel you've been, Rabin Can, Sally Winley. Thank you very much for your time. And to Laura Dooney for a great job producing the show. I'm Wallace Chapman, back Monday 3:45. Stay with RNZ. Checkpoint is right after this.
Whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. E haere aki nei, stay the course, the Prime Minister says. There will be no early release for Aucklanders locked down at COVID Alert Level 3. A bus rides under scrutiny after it's identified as a possible link between an infected St Luke's retail worker and the South Auckland cluster. There are 9 new coronavirus cases linked to the community outbreak. Are super city roadblocks driving a wedge between you and your spuds, collie and lettuce? Presidential hopeful Joe Biden promises hope over fear and fact over fiction in his big virtual convention speech. Netball finally gets its grand final, and game day just got further away for rugby's big North-South showdown.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora, ko Susana Leata tēnei. Companies which have paid no income tax have received more than $2 billion in government wage subsidies. Another round of wage subsidies is available from today to help cover the costs of Auckland's COVID outbreak. Figures released to Checkpoint show tens of thousands of companies receiving the payment haven't paid tax. Tax expert Jeff Nightingale says the payment is going to their employees who will be taxed.
New Zealand's got about maybe 500, maybe 600,000 companies, and that 10% of them might not be paying corporate tax at the moment, either because they're new or because they're shareholder employee salaries or things. When I think about it, that doesn't feel too frightening.
Jeff Nightingale says $2 billion is a relatively small portion of the more than $13 billion which has been paid out in government wage subsidies. The Prime Minister says Cabinet will make the call on Monday whether to lift Level 3 and Level 2 restrictions. It met today to review the settings of the current COVID-19 settings. Jacinda Ardern says while there are encouraging signs that the Auckland cluster has been circled, there is more work to do. She says it's important to see how the pattern of new cases develops over the weekend.
There is nothing to suggest we need to change our course. And certainly nothing that suggests we need to escalate our response. But at this stage, we need to stay the course and retain the settings we have for now.
Jacinda Ardern says this outbreak has been complex and it could have been enormous if it weren't for the Level 3 restrictions. The government has launched an independent review in the plagued billion-dollar project Transmission Gully. The Transport Agency today announced a further $208 million taxpayer dollars was being provided to get the highway completed. Charlotte Cook reports.
Transmission Gully, intended as a new route between Wellington Region and the Kapiti Coast, was supposed to cost $850 million. It's since been delayed nearly 2 years and has blown the budget by $400 million, costing taxpayers $1.25 billion to get the job finished. The Transport Minister Phil Twyford says the Infrastructure Commission will oversee an urgent and wide-ranging review into the project. He says it's been plagued with delays and increased costs, and the original agreement appears to have been rushed through by the former government. The opening date for Transmission Gully is now set for September 2021. This is Charlotte Cook.
The Prime Minister says the government is trying to resolve tensions between Canterbury District Health Board's clinicians and board members before healthcare is impacted. 7 members of the board's executive team have resigned since July, with one speaking out today and citing the adversarial attitude of the board as her reason for leaving. Minister of Health Chris Hipkins spoke to the board chair Sir John Hanson today. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern says the government knows it needs to move quickly and it's working hard to play a constructive role in resolving the health board's issues. A man has been sentenced to 4 years and 5 months imprisonment for the manslaughter of his baby daughter last year. Marie Takuira Mita Ngahere was less than 4 weeks old when she was found dead from head injuries at her home in Kaitaia on February the 19th. Her 24-year-old father, J.C. Ngahere, was sentenced for her manslaughter in the High Court at Whangarei today. Detective Inspector Lloyd Schmid said Marie suffered traumatic injuries before her death, which has greatly impacted the people of Kaitaia. It's coming up to 4 minutes past 5. The North-South rugby match scheduled for Auckland's Eden Park has been postponed for a week because of the COVID-19 restrictions preventing the teams from training together. The match was due to be played tomorrow week and New Zealand Rugby has made contingency plans for it to be transferred to Wellington. But the 14 Auckland-based players involved have been denied exemptions to leave the region. New Zealand Rugby's Chris Lendrum says they'll now wait until Monday to decide where the game will be played, subject to the government's decision around alert levels.
We remain really hopeful that the game will play that weekend, either in Auckland or Wellington. It's been a really up and down week of trying to work out whether this game can go ahead or not.
Chris Lendrum. Stephen Adams and the Oklahoma City Thunder are heading for a fourth straight first-round exit from the NBA basketball playoffs. The Thunder trailed the Houston Rockets 2-0 in their best-of-7 Western Conference series after losing Game 2 111-98 in Orlando. Adams was restricted to 8 points but led the Thunder with 11 rebounds. Experienced New Zealand cyclist Sam Bewley feels well prepared for his maiden Tour de France. The 33-year-old has been named in the Mitchelton Scott team for the race, which starts next weekend. It'll be Bewley's 9th Grand Tour, and he doesn't believe the Tour de France will be any harder than the tours of Italy or Spain. That's the news.
Tomorrow morning, Sinead Boucher on how she came to own a media company for $1. Sarah Seeger on astronomy and autism. And that's something Jodie Rogers knows a lot about too. She's involved in the Netflix series called Love on the Spectrum. And Richard Russell of Excel Recording shares some of his favourite music. Join me, Kim Hill, tomorrow morning from 8 on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland to Kapiti, including central high country. Also Coromandel Peninsula and Bay of Plenty. Showers and fine breaks, squally thunderstorms and hail possible tonight. Showers clearing tomorrow, returning to Northland and Auckland from tomorrow afternoon. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, fine and warm weather. Wellington, Wairarapa and Marlborough, a few showers clearing tomorrow and fine spells increasing. For Nelson, fine spells, occasional showers and possible thunderstorms, mostly about the Western Ranges, clearing tomorrow. Bulla and Westland, rain mostly north of the glaciers with heavy falls and thunderstorms possible. Easing to a few showers from tonight and clearing by tomorrow. Canterbury, Otago and Southland, fine breaks inland, low cloud about the coast, patchy drizzle tonight, isolated showers tomorrow afternoon. Fiordland, cloudy periods and a few showers. Chatham Islands, a few showers, clearing later tomorrow. RNZ National. It's coming up to 7 minutes past 5.
Thanks, Susanna. Happy Friday, everyone. This is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. Coming up on the program, Aucklanders prepare to be locked down until at least next Wednesday. Health officials say a bus trip is the likely link between a St Luke's retail worker and the Americold cluster. And rugby bosses prepare for the possibility of a north-south match with no fans. But we begin tonight back in Christchurch, where the health board at the centre of a leadership meltdown went to ground today, as doctors renewed their call for urgent government intervention. Crown Monitor Dr Lester Levy said today that the Canterbury District Health Board's financial performance has been seriously deteriorating over the past 5 years, with its deficit increasing tenfold over that same period. 7 members of the Health Board's executive team have now resigned since July, and one spoke out today pointing to the adversarial attitude of the board members as her reason for the mass exodus. Katie Todd explains.
To patients, today might have felt like a normal day in the wards and halls of Christchurch Hospital. But under the surface, New Zealand Nurses Organisation Chief Executive Memo Musa says it's hard for medical staff to ignore the gaping hole in their leadership and fresh uncertainties about their big move into the new acute services building next door, scheduled to happen in November. The person overseeing the move, Nurse Director Mary Gordon, was one of 2 more executive team members to quit yesterday, following 5 others, including Chief Executive David Mates.
When you lose senior clinicians who have engaged and worked with staff over many difficult times, staff are at a loss to understand why this is happening.
Today, one departing leader confirmed what many in the medical community had speculated, that the mass exodus is at least partly because of tensions between the Canterbury District Health Board's executive team and the board. Chief Medical Officer Sue Nightingale handed in her resignation a week ago, and she'll finish up in December. She told RNZ today the Health Board's values of care and respect weren't being lived up to. Ms Nightingale says previous boards worked with the executive team to do the right thing for the Canterbury population, while still holding the executive team to account.
That's their job, to hold us to account, but since the transition to this current board, the atmosphere, the strategy, I guess, has changed to one of being extremely adversarial.
The board endorsed a plan to reduce its $180 million deficit yesterday, despite fears from the medical community that Canterbury's staff and services would be cut. Charity Hospital founder Phil Bagshaw says there needs to be an intervention from the government.
Just putting them back in is not the solution. I think that the solution is that we need some senior leadership to come down here and sort the whole situation out. These are just symptoms. There is an underlying cause, and what needs to be addressed is the underlying cause.
Former chairman of the Waitemata Auckland and Counties Manukau DHBs, Dr Lester Levy, was last year appointed as a Crown Monitor to help the Canterbury DHB curb its deficit. He declined to be interviewed today, but in a statement said he was brought in to resolve what had been a very seriously deteriorating financial performance over the past 5 years, with the financial deficit increasing tenfold over that period. Dr Levy went on to say the annual plan for 2020-21 was approved by the board yesterday without any changes asked for by the board. He said the plan is management's plan and includes their savings targets, which were accepted as put forward. At this afternoon's COVID briefing, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern gave assurances the government is trying to resolve tensions between board and clinicians before healthcare is impacted.
It is fair to say that we are working very hard to play a constructive role in the dispute and the tension that obviously exists within the DHB. And we do have a role to play there. The Minister has been very, very active in trying to help resolve some of those issues.
Minister of Health Chris Hipkins confirmed he'd been in contact with the board's chair Sir John Hanson today and would be speaking to him again on Monday. Embattled board members declined to comment, and RNZ's requests to speak to the board chair directly were also declined. His only comments came in the form of a message to staff. In it, a plea to continue focusing on providing the best possible care to the community despite an unsettling time for everyone. For Checkpoint, ko Katie Todd, TNA.
There'll be no early release from lockdown for a third of the country living under level 3 restrictions. The message from the Prime Minister today, stay the course. That means the current restrictions, with Auckland at alert level 3 and the rest of the country at level 2, will remain in place until at least Wednesday next week. Here's our political reporter Katie Scotcher.
The country's biggest city has been in lockdown for 10 days.
Everyone in Auckland knows what those restrictions have meant. No face-to-face retail shopping, no gatherings, no school. They're sacrifices.
And those restrictions will remain in place for now, after Cabinet met this morning to review them.
There is nothing to suggest we need to change our course, and certainly nothing that suggests we need to escalate our response. But at this stage, we need to stay the course.
Ministers will decide on Monday if lockdown measures can be eased and what the next steps are. The Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, not ruling anything in or out.
We almost always consider a range of options, particularly given we're dealing with the country being at 2 different alert levels. So we will consider the potential of different configurations.
Cabinet will be briefed on the latest COVID-19 information and advised at that meeting by the Director-General of Health, Ashley Bloomfield. Dr Bloomfield says he won't just be looking at the number of cases in the community over the weekend.
It's the pattern and the ability to know that those cases are part of the community outbreak.
Ms Ardern says there will be other things Cabinet ministers will consider.
The effects on local economies, at-risk populations, how people have been following the rules and the ability to operationalise a new alert level.
If Auckland remains at a higher alert level than the rest of the country, travel restrictions could remain in place.
If you had a scenario where one part of the country was at a different alert level, lesser than level 3 than the other, actually those levels have usually included interregional travel, but then you have the issue of limits on mass gatherings in one part of the country and not in the rest. So those are some technicalities and things we need to take into account with our decision.
The Prime Minister is adamant Cabinet won't always impose lockdown restrictions if there are future outbreaks in the community. But she says there were factors that made this cluster difficult to manage and the lockdown necessary.
It started in our most densely populated city and also hit our community in South Auckland where we have higher levels of social interaction. Our first case in the cluster has not yet been linked to any obvious source. But within this outbreak, we've also seen an example of where If it had happened on its own, we wouldn't have needed extended restrictions. That is the Ridges case.
Like previous alert level changes, people will be given 48 hours notice before restrictions are lifted. And this would be done at once, rather than suburb by suburb. But if or when this will happen will all be revealed on Monday. Atu i te whare parimata mo te hōtaka o te ahiahi nei, ko Katie Scott Churaho.
Auckland's Level 3 lockdown has put the skids on the North-South Inter-Island rugby match for at least another week. The game was supposed to be played at Auckland's Eden Park on Saturday week, but New Zealand Rugby made contingency plans to shift it to Wellington when Auckland went into Alert Level 3. But Plan B was scuppered too when 14 Auckland-based players were denied travel exemptions because of the COVID-19 lockdown. New Zealand Rugby's General Manager of Professional Rugby, Chris Lendrum, is philosophical about the setback as they become used to living week to week.
Look, we're frustrated only to the extent that we can't play the game when we wanted to play it. We were really hopeful of getting this fixture up for our fans and for our players and coaches and so forth Saturday week, and now we can't. But we're not frustrated about the decision. We've worked really closely with the government all the way through the COVID period, and we'll respect their decision and abide by it.
Yeah, can you just talk us through that decision? You applied for some exemptions, they were denied. Why was that?
Look, Lisa, our understanding of the exemption process, and to be fair, we've been learning as the week's gone on, is that exemptions are very limited and there's a very high threshold to them being granted. Essentially, threat to life, limb, very high threshold for business exemptions and the like. And unfortunately, our case just didn't meet that on this occasion.
Did you have any conversations with ministers, like the Minister for Sport?
Look, we submitted our application through the normal processes, just like any other business or individual would. But as you'd imagine, for a sport and organisation our size, we have contacts at ministerial level, both directly and through Sport New Zealand. So we had those discussions during the week, but the position was always very clear and consistent from the government. We received notification of the exemption being declined late yesterday.
So, okay, you've got to postpone. What are the challenges involved in that then?
Well, look, it's been a year of challenges, right? And so the staff and people involved are very used to changing plans on the fly. It's not easy. I'm not going to lie about that. But a lot now turns on the government's decisions around alert levels in the coming days next week. That'll determine two things, whether we can play in Auckland or whether we can play in Wellington, or I suppose ultimately whether we can play at all. And also, if we can play, whether those games will go ahead with crowds or without.
Yeah, so you've got to kind of plan and have contingencies. So what's your best scenario at the moment? Are you working on playing the game in Auckland or are you working on playing the game in Wellington?
Yeah, look, the best scenario will be to play the game in Auckland in front of a crowd. If Auckland can return to level 1 in time for the game on the 5th, we obviously simply don't know whether that's going to be possible. It's not in our control, nor is it our area of expertise, so we'll trust and work with the government. And if we can't play it in Auckland, then we'll happily play it in Wellington, and more so if we can get a crowd there.
How late can you leave that decision?
Well, we were leaving a decision in respect of next week as late as today. So the key thing is we need to assemble our players and management and other staff required to run the game on a Monday prior to a game going ahead on the Saturday. So if we're looking at the 5th as the date now, you work back and it's essentially we'd need to know in a couple of days before the Monday prior.
So obviously if where you want to play is in level 2, that's not a goer because you can only have up to 100 people. You're not keen on playing without a crowd?
No, look, we would consider playing without a crowd, absolutely. I think this is a game that has the rugby public really excited. We want to play it as as a reward for the players who have performed so well during Investec Super Rugby Aotearoa and for our fans. And whilst it would not be ideal to play it essentially behind closed doors, there would still be an enormous broadcast audience for that game, and we'd be looking to make it happen. Clearly not our preference, but a plan B.
I know things have been tough for the entire year. Financially, do you really, would your preference be to be able to have a crowd?
Clearly, if we can ticket the match, then that will provide additional revenue into the organisation, which in turn we can use to fund our expenditure at community and professional level. So, it would be fantastic if we could do that. It would be fantastic, likewise, if we can get further All Black and national team fixtures happening in the latter part of the year. But it is a challenging year, and we just don't know. It's very much a day-to-day or week-to-week existence for us at the moment. And the people who are working in these areas day after day are just doing an outstanding job responding to the adversity and the uncertainty.
Chris, given all of the uncertainty that you have faced and are facing because of this pandemic, how realistic is it to even entertain the idea of a Trans-Tasman competition next year?
Oh, it's a good question, Lisa. Look, that's a very fair question as well, because, we're essentially looking back now 5 months from the point where we first locked down as a country, and I think we would all hope that we were a little bit further along than we have been, in spite of the fantastic job that New Zealanders have done. And it does have an impact on us. We're going to have to consider that over the coming weeks in terms of the ongoing impact on our planning, and when we need to deliver certainty for our players and clubs and so forth. So we continue to monitor that, and we'll have more for everyone on that on those points in the future.
Realistically, though, is it actually going to happen? I mean, you're watching what's going on in Australia, even what's going on here in recent days.
Yeah, look, you would have to say there's an increasing level of doubt if you're thinking about starting a Trans-Tasman competition in late February or early March, but there is still an amount of time to go, and we don't have to make those decisions right now. I think that's the key point. We clearly will have to make them soon to allow commercial partners and clubs, season ticket holders and so forth to start making some plans with certainty. But we'll just keep monitoring it and working closely with government as we have done, and we'll make the decision when we need to.
And that's Chris Lendrum from New Zealand Rugby. It is almost 23 minutes past 5 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. We're keen for your feedback. If you're in Auckland stuck under level 3 alert until next week sometime, are you happy with that decision to stay the course, as the Prime Minister puts it, or are you facing any particular challenges? We would love to hear from you. You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or send us an email. checkpoint@rnz.co.nz is our address. More than $2 billion of wage subsidies have been paid to businesses which have never paid company tax. So far, more than $13 billion has been paid out through the government's wage subsidy schemes, with another round available from today following the second COVID outbreak. Figures released to Checkpoint show tens of thousands of companies receiving the payment haven't paid tax, but economists say it's not a slight on the subsidy scheme, which has kept thousands of people in their jobs. Nita Blake-Person reports.
The government's wage subsidies have been vital in the economic response to the COVID-19 chaos. $13.2 billion has been paid out, and as of last Friday, nearly 280,000 jobs were being supported, 15,000 for the original wage subsidy and 263,000 for the extension. Many of the businesses accessing the subsidies are small to medium outfits, and according to information released to Checkpoint from Inland Revenue, $2.1 billion has been given to companies which have never paid income tax. A lot of money, but PwC partner and tax expert Jeff Nightingale says some tax is still being paid.
It would have been paid out as wages, and it would have been all subject to PAYE, so that's in the tax net. And, New Zealand's got about maybe 500, maybe 600,000 companies, and that 10% of them might not be paying corporate tax at the moment, either because they're new or because they're shareholder employee salaries or things. When I think about it, that doesn't feel too frightening.
$1.7 billion was paid to 38,000 businesses which were registered before March last year. A smaller portion, 13,000 businesses receiving $440 million, were registered after March and therefore would not have been expected to have paid any tax yet. CTU economist Lydia Coe says there's a range of reasons for not paying tax.
Often the company tax rate is higher than some levels of the personal tax scale, and so it can make sense that shareholders receive income in the form of salaries at a lower tax rate than leaving it in the company and paying the 28 cents. So that's just a standard feature of our tax system, the personal tax scale and the company tax.
Infometrics economist Brad Olson says the numbers have to be taken in the context of the $11 billion that had been paid out in wage subsidies back in June.
I think we do need to realise that that's still 10% of businesses and 15% of the total wage subsidy bill that's gone to those who were, not making a profit beforehand. Now, that doesn't necessarily dictate that they were in a tough financial position beforehand, but it certainly doesn't tell you that the reverse was true. They were in a strong financial position. So it's not overly alarming, but it's also not cause for elation.
Figures out today from the Ministry for Social Development show nearly 13,000 companies have made refunds to the wage subsidy scheme, worth $389 million. Lydia Coe says while there are always some badly behaved companies, overall the scheme has been a huge success.
I think the wage subsidy has performed superbly well. Here at the CTU we have had reports of quite a high level of abuse, but to be fair, 1.7 million employees have received the benefit of the wage subsidy, and there's no way we've had anywhere near that level of reports of abuse.
A new round of the wage subsidy opens today. Businesses can apply for a 2-week payment for up to $1,171 per worker, which is estimated will support 930,000 jobs. To be eligible, businesses have to have had a 40% revenue drop across a 2-week period between the 12th of August and 10th of September compared to a similar period last year. The wage subsidy will be available nationwide to reflect the huge impact the Auckland lockdown has had across the whole country. For Checkpoint, Nita Blakeperson.
Frustrated farmers in the country's vegetable heartland have been assured they will now be able to operate following high-level government intervention. COVID-19 checkpoints along the Waikato-Auckland border have caused headaches for essential workers who say they're planting the veggies for the country's Christmas dinner. And while there's now a broad class exemption for horticulture, there were real fears this week that food production in Pukekohe would grind to a halt. Alex Perrottet has the story.
Woodsy Barner is one of the owner-operators of Barner Family Farms. You've probably eaten his potatoes, but Auckland's Level 3 lockdown drove a huge wedge between his Pukekohe packhouse and his Waikato farms.
All of our production has gone on the Waikato, which is 10 k's going in past into Tukau. We're cutting cabbage, collie and lettuce every morning for the supermarkets.
But with police checking every driver's papers and licences, long queues have formed, delaying the work. And it's not just farmers who need to get through, as Woodsy Barner found out when his harvester broke down this week and he needed to call a specialist to repair it.
And he says, I can't get to the border. I said, you're joking, mate. And he says, no, they won't let me through. So here I am sitting in the paddock, 8 of us, and looking around, and I look at the phone that says rain is still on its way here, and we can't get much production done because of these problems.
Mike Chapman is the CEO of Horticulture New Zealand and says he's working closely with the Ministry of Primary Industries as well as the Ministry of Health, which is overseeing the lockdown. But he's had to make it very clear just how important this Pukekohe engine room is. Supplying a third of the country, they're planting what's going to be on the plates of New Zealanders in a few months' time.
What we're planting now will be on the tables in Christmas. So you've got to keep your production cycles running. And it's really unfortunate that the border that was established straddled and cut the Pukekohe growing area in half. And that's caused real issues and real tensions, but we're working with the government to try and make it work as best as possible in these very difficult circumstances.
The Ministry of Health was not available for interview. A senior media advisor saying staff were just too busy working through the more than 7,800 applications for exemptions. As of yesterday, it had granted more than 1,000 exemptions and declined 100. But MPI has also been involved. On the weekend, it quickly obtained exemptions for those working in the border farms, but the workers didn't have the papers as they sat in 3-hour queues on Monday morning. And although a broad exemption for all horticulture workers was gazetted on the ministry's website on Tuesday, growers say MPI was preparing to remove several of them from an exemption list in a bid to cut it down. Julie Collins is the Deputy Director-General for Te Ururako Forestry New Zealand, but she's taken on the high-level negotiating role at MPI for this matter. She says the list came from Horticulture New Zealand.
The original list Hort provided to us was really, really long because they had to pull it together really, really quickly. And it had things like horticulture growers in the South Island who obviously didn't need to be on a list to travel across that Greater Auckland boundary. So there was a process at the beginning of the week between us and Hort New Zealand, which was refining that list, and they were taking people off and adding people on as they got a better understanding of who was affected.
But Mike Chapman says it wasn't Horticulture New Zealand that was taking people off the list.
We developed a list and no one was excluded from it. Look, we've resolved the issues, what I'm prepared to say. You know, we're talking about something that's only a few days old, and we are all the time refining it to make it work as best as possible.
But some growers say there wasn't proper consultation. Woodsy Barner says any threat to food production has serious ramifications.
That would have caused a real racket, you know, that it would have caused a panic in the Auckland region, and we don't want to start that.
He says it prompted a crisis call with the Minister, Damien O'Connor, yesterday, but the Minister played it down.
Look, it wasn't a crisis meeting. NPI had agreed to listen to Hort New Zealand and a few of the growers expressing their frustrations. I wasn't surprised with that situation. I tried to explain that we've still got to maintain strict criteria to ensure that COVID doesn't spread, and we'll agree to, and have agreed to work with the growers to try and iron out any particular glitches.
He says he understands the frustration, but everyone is doing it tough.
Clearly, health have a focus on preventing the spread of COVID and shutting this down. We support that. There will be some difficulties for many sectors and many businesses until we get on top of this.
But Woodsy Barner says his is a crucial industry. He says the vegetables Kiwis are eating today were planted during the first lockdown, when workers like him were risking their health and safety to provide for the country. He says movement across the border has improved today, but lessons need to be learned for any future border closures.
The government and the people down in Wellington, they don't realise the extent of getting produce from the field to the supermarket.
The growers will find out if there will be any extension to the border closure on Monday. For Checkpoint, Alex Perrottet.
And coming up on Checkpoint on RNZ National, a Taranaki couple vows to fight to stay in their house, which is in the path of the province's biggest roading project in ages. Hope over fear and fact over fiction, promises Democratic presidential hopeful Joe Biden. Almost 1 out of every 10 New Zealanders is living with the risk of a tsunami, and netball finally gets its grand final. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget you can get in touch via text 2101. You can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, Facebook us Checkpoint, or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. But first, here's Susanna with the headlines.
Tens of thousands of companies which have paid no tax have received more than $2 billion in government wage subsidies. Tax expert Jeff Nightingale says it's a relatively small portion of the more than $13 billion which has been paid out in the subsidies. Cabinet will monitor the pattern of any new COVID-19 cases over the weekend and make the call about whether to drop alert levels across the country, including Auckland, on Monday. The Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern says this outbreak has been complex and it could have been enormous if it weren't for the Level 3 restrictions. The government has launched an independent review into a plagued project to create a new highway between the Wellington region and the Kapiti coast. The Transport Agency today announced a further $208 million taxpayer dollars was being provided to get Transmission Gully completed. It was supposed to cost $850 million in total, but instead looks set to cost $1.25 billion. The North-South Inter-Island rugby match has been delayed for at least a week because COVID-19 restrictions have prevented 14 Auckland-based players from leaving the region. New Zealand Rugby's Chris Lendrum told Checkpoint it's been a year of challenges and those involved are getting used to changing plans on the fly. The government has stepped in to try to resolve tensions within Canterbury District Health Board before healthcare is impacted. 7 members of the board's executive team have resigned since last month, including its chief executive. An Invercargill couple who won a $5 million share of last weekend's massive Powerball prize kept the ticket in their car's glove box, oblivious to how much it was worth. The retired pair only found out they were part winners of the $50 million jackpot when they checked the ticket at a local grocery store and burst into tears when they found out. Those are the latest news headlines on RNZ National. Our next news and weather update is at 6.
Thanks, Susanna. Kia ora anō. This is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. It is time now for the business news with Emma Hatton. Hi, Emma. Reserve Bank's given us some insight into how it feels its bond buying program is working. So what might it do next?
Hi, Lisa. Yes, so the Reserve Bank held a webinar today for anyone who wanted to dial into to talk about their latest monetary policy statement and explain kind of exactly what it's doing. And they did this because, before COVID, the Reserve Bank kind of operated in the background. It wasn't really, in the forefront of anybody's mind. I don't think people really cared what they were doing so long as, interest rates were steady and inflation wasn't through the roof. So, but since COVID, everything they've been doing has become quite mainstream because they've got such an important role to play in helping keep things stable. So what they did is they had this webinar so that they could kind of explain some of these concepts and try and get through why they were doing it and what it was and what they might do next. So its chief economist sort of took the reins on a lot of it, which was really great to hear from him. And basically they're saying, look, their big government bond buying program is working, and we can see that because retail rates are falling. And, you might have refixed your mortgage lately and noticed that you can get a better rate for it and things like that. You may have also noticed that you're not getting as much from your term deposits and things like that as well. And so they're saying, look, that's working. However, that LSAP program, it will only take rates down so far, and it might need to look at what it needs to do to get them down even further. And it's starting to look at something called negative interest rates. And what they are talking about there is not your mortgage going into negative and not retail rates going negative. Unfortunately, the bank is probably not going to pay you to take out a mortgage with them. But what they're talking about there is dropping the wholesale rate, so the rate that between them and the retail banks. And so it's saying that that's something that they might look to do early next year. And what they'll probably do alongside that is some term lending, so they'll lend some extra money to banks so that there's just more money for the banks to lend out as well. And it's all just trying to increase this, the spending, make it as attractive as possible for people to borrow and for people to spend and to just keep the economy well oiled. So it was really nice to hear from them and just kind of explain some of those concepts which we might hear thrown around quite a bit, things like quantitative easing and that, and just kind of explain what they are. So that's where we're at. It's working for now. They're going to have a look in the new year and see what the outlook is like for the economy. And if they think more needs to be done, that negative rate could be on the cards. But yes, don't get too excited by the thought that the bank might pay you to actually take your money out of the bank.
Absolutely. Okay, let's move on to Kiwisaver. So there are calls to scrap the default Kiwisaver fund scheme. Now, why is that?
Yeah, so this is a call that's come from a financial advice firm, and what they're saying is that people who are newly signed up to Kiwisaver, the plan is at this stage is that you just go into one of 9 default fund schemes, and so it's just randomly allocated. It's even across all 9. All the big banks have a default fund and then there's other ones as well. And what you can do is you can decide what scheme you want to go in right at the start, or once you're in the default one, you can change out at any time, or you can opt out of Kiwisaver altogether. the criticism is that the default funds are conservative funds, so they're low risk, low return. And a lot of the people that are signing up to Kiwisaver for the first time are young people. They're, people getting their first jobs and things like that. And there's no real reason for them to be in a really low risk fund because they're not going to be wanting to take their money out anytime soon. They really should be in a high growth fund. And so what the issue is that if people don't know that they're in a default fund, they just think, I've got Kiwisaver, I'm doing my bit, but they don't know that there's a different type of fund that they should be in. They just stay there until it's, maybe they think, I'll look at getting my first home. And by that stage, they're way behind on how much money they could have had if they were in a high growth fund. So the plan is if they scrapped the default fund scheme, people could get the advice up front as they're signing up for Kiwisaver. They can look at exactly what fund they should go in and, they wouldn't get trapped in this conservative fund and not really know anything about it. The issue with that is that if people are going to be disengaged with their Kiwisavers, they're probably going to be disengaged no matter what system is set up. And so what the alternative might be is that if people don't take up this financial advice at the time of signing up, they might never select a Kiwisaver fund at all. And so that's, arguably even worse than going into one that gives them low returns. So there's a real balance there between how do fund providers contact those who just aren't engaged with their Kiwisaver to educate them on how it works. Because we saw what happens when people don't know how Kiwisaver works. There was over $1 billion worth of funds transferred from high growth to conservative during that March quarter when the markets just went right down. And it was because people didn't understand that it was an investment and it would likely come back. And so a lot of people locked in those gains, those losses rather, which was really, really sad. And so, there's an argument there that the default scheme isn't working and that default fund providers aren't trying hard enough to reach those people. The default fund providers reject that completely and say, look, some people are just basically, we just can't reach them.
Before you go, Emma, let's do a quick whip around the markets.
Yep, so the markets were up today quite nicely, actually, up 1.5%. So getting back some of those gains that they lost over the last couple of days, closed down 11,836 points. New Zealand dollar is trading at 65.4 US cents, 90.8 Australian and 49.4 British pence.
Thanks, Emma. Emma, have a lovely weekend at Lockdown Level 2 in Wellington. That's Emma Hatton with our business news. It's 9 days since Auckland went into Alert Level 3 and the Auckland City Mission says it's handing out just as many food parcels as it was during the peak of the first lockdown back in March. Social services across the city say demand for food and other assistance has ramped up again as families are pushed to the brink. Our social issues reporter Sarah Robson and visual journalist Dan Cook went behind the scenes at the Auckland City Mission to find out how it's helping those most in need.
It's Friday morning in a semi-industrial part of central Auckland and forklifts are buzzing around unloading pallets from trucks. This is ground zero for the Auckland City Mission's response to COVID-19, and those pallets are stacked with boxes and boxes of food that will end up in the pantries and fridges of some of the city's most vulnerable whānau. The City Missioner Chris Farrelly says at the peak of the first lockdown in March, it was handing out 3 times as many food parcels as it usually would. Some of that demand eased off as the country moved down to level 1, but Mr Farrelly says it's ramped back up again.
We've moved back to the trebling again. So as of today, we're pushing out from this place and our other centres about 3 times what we would have been at the same time last year.
That's about 1,200 food parcels a week, not to mention all the bulk supplies the mission sends out to dozens of smaller community food banks around the city. The latest lockdown has brought a second wave of job losses, and Chris Farrelly says people are struggling.
There's some new faces appearing that were not appearing before. Literally, there are people asking now for help for the first time in their lives.
People calling the City Mission for help include foreigners who have been stranded in New Zealand since the pandemic hit, students, families who have breadwinners out of work, and overwhelmingly women.
We are preparing for the reality that what we're doing now is going to continue for the long term, not the short term.
It's here at the Auckland City Mission's Grafton Distribution Centre that all of the donated goods are sorted and packed into food parcels. Teams of up to 10 volunteers are working morning and afternoon shifts to make sure all of the food gets to people in need.
What we try to do as a standard rule is have enough food for 4 people for 4 days for a family. Usually we will adjust the number of parcels of food depending on number of people in a family.
That's Tracy Goddard, the woman in charge of what is a mammoth logistical operation.
So you have a selection. We've got a fresh food and vegetable box here with a nice beautiful selection of fruit and vegetables that should last a family for a good week. We have some toiletries, loo paper and soap, basic essentials, flour, which we bulk bag down because it's quite hard to get in times like these, rice, pasta.
As well as the pantry staples, Tracy Goddard says whānau need other household items too.
We're often short of things like toothpaste and toothbrushes. Feminine care sanitary products are always in big demand. Something like 80%, if not more, of the people that seek assistance are female, mums, aunties, grandmothers.
Tracy Goddard says at the moment they've got plenty of food and other goods in stock.
But last lockdown, we were spending, am I allowed to say, anywhere between $15,000 to $20,000 a week during level 4 to keep the supply going. We're not doing that right now because the appeal that went through has really helped us, but I imagine if we go through more lockdowns, we will be having to revert back to that.
Until COVID-19 hit, Christmas has usually been the City Mission's busiest time of year. Chris Farrelly says continued support from the community will be crucial over the months ahead.
And we know that Christmas actually does really expose the cracks. There's so many other demands. So we're preparing for a Christmas like no other.
Mō te hōtaka o te ahi, ko Sarah Robson. Aho.
It is 5:45. I'm Lisa Owen and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Keen for your feedback on anything you've heard on the program this evening. Are you using the services, the food bank? And how hard is it this time round in lockdown? You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or send us an email, checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. I give you my word, if you entrust me with the presidency, I will draw on the best of us, not the worst. We'll choose hope over fear, fact over fiction. Those are the words of Democratic presidential hopeful Joe Biden during his big virtual convention speech. A global pandemic forced the party to take the 4-day rally online, with Biden closing out the event. The 77-year-old former vice president delivered the speech inside an empty arena in his hometown of Wilmington, Delaware. CNN's correspondent Nadia Romero was there and says at times it got quite emotional.
This was the old Joe Biden that I remember from 5-10 years ago. He was so sharp, deliberate, and passionate in his remarks, even getting teary-eyed, and you could tell in his voice when he was talking about his beloved late son, Beau Biden. You could tell over the years they had such a great, strong connection. It really seemed like Beau was leading his life after his father was public service, and then at the age of 46, died of brain cancer. And that was really the reason why Joe Biden did not run for president back in 2016. But he said that he promised his son, Beau, that he would continue with his political aspirations, working for the people, and eventually running for president again. And so here we are 4 years later. Joe Biden took the stage. He's done it 2 other times, hoping to be the nominee for the Democrat Party, and finally accomplishing that tonight. And he was sharp. He was passionate. He was very direct. Now, he didn't spend a ton of time talking about President Donald Trump. He left that up to former President Barack Obama and former presidential candidate and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton to really bash Trump over the first couple of days of the convention. But Joe Biden really talked more about his vision for America and harping on hope, optimism, change, the same sentiments we heard from the Obama-Biden administration back in 2008 and 2012.
So how difficult would it have been for him to deliver that speech? Because normally you're getting energy from the room, aren't you? You're getting a reaction from the crowd. He's in a vacuum giving one of the most important speeches of the year for him, and there's really nobody there.
Yeah, and this was something that you wondered about. How would he handle this moment? As you mentioned, we all know that Joe Biden is not known for being the greatest orator, right? He's not the best public speaker. He was struggling with a speech impediment for much of his childhood, but he worked through that. And that's why he has this no malarkey kind of slogan or motto about himself. He cuts to the chase. He tells it like it is. And he really hopes that people will see that he's empathetic, that he's compassionate. And that's really what he tried to convey tonight, that he's a man who lost loved ones. He's a man who's been through heartache, and he's fighting for you because he's been there. He understands hardship, and he also understands how to triumph from that. And this was a difficult time because throughout this entire convention, the first time ever being virtual, you don't have the streamers and the banners and the chanting and the energy from the crowd, but he performed so well tonight, really leaving it all out there and wearing his heart on his sleeve.
Nadia, do we know how many people tuned into this, what seems to be the world's longest Zoom call over 3 days? How many people actually watched it?
You know, I think it's hard to calculate. I saw a number the other day that was at 23 million. Don't quote me on that. I think it will be hard to really calculate who was watching this. There are some people who watched on Facebook Live, on Instagram Live. There are other people who went on to the Democrat National Convention YouTube and watched it. Then you have the folks that watch it on live stream in other ways. And then there are some people who watched on network cable or television to see this speech. I think it's going to be really hard to tell. What usually happens after a convention, and maybe this will be an indicator, is the money that comes to the DNC or the RNC. Will they have a boost in donors and people who say, you know what, I believe in him now. I believe in her. Here's $50. Here's $50,000, whatever the amount may be. The other thing that we look for after a convention is what's called a convention bounce. And that's usually when you see a boost in the polls for whoever wrapped up their convention. So right now, we would expect to see the latest polling coming out and showing Joe Biden in a really favorable light. And then after the Republican National Convention next week, we would expect that same convention boost after the RNC. So those are a bit of superficial numbers, but that is a way to measure how well someone did, how many people tuned in. And really, for a lot of Americans, it's not until the conventions that they really dial in. I've been on the campaign trail since the beginning, but most people are not engulfed in it every day. So the conventions may be their first look at hearing the party's platform and learning more about who the candidate is besides their public policy record.
Another way you can tell how well you did is how President Trump responds, isn't it? So has he fired up on Twitter or the like?
Absolutely. You can really tell when he's upset. He starts to tweet in all caps, and he did that just last night after former President Barack Obama just slammed him in his very eloquent and powerful speech. And President Obama has been his arch nemesis, I would say, for many, many years now. And so that really fired up the president. The president spent time today in the town next to Scranton, Pennsylvania, in that area where Joe Biden was born and where he spent a little chunk of his childhood before his family relocated here to Wilmington, Delaware. The president went there only to troll Joe Biden, only to try to take away the spotlight, to rain on his parade. And so the president is a gamesman. He's a showman. He was in Hollywood as an entertainer before entering the political arena, and he knows how to get under people's skin. He makes up these nicknames for people. Sometimes they're racist, sometimes they're sexist, oftentimes they're offensive, and that's who the president is. And you will see that on Twitter as it plays out.
And that was CNN's correspondent Nadia Romero joining us from the Democratic, virtual convention. The most well-known critic of the Kremlin, Alexei Navalny, is fighting for his life in a Siberian hospital after drinking tea that his allies claim was laced with poison. European leaders have offered to help, and a German peace foundation is hoping to fly him to Berlin for treatment. However, the doctor treating Mr. Navalny says moving him would risk his life. The ABC's Nick Dole reports.
On a plane bound for Moscow, someone films as paramedics rush to help a passenger in pain. Witnesses say Alexei Navalny fell ill suddenly. He went to the toilet and never came back. The pilots made an emergency landing. He was taken to hospital in the city of Omsk and put on a ventilator. Doctors say his condition has stabilised and they're trying to work out what caused the episode. But Mr Navalny's supporters are convinced he ingested poison in a cup of tea shortly before boarding. He drank only black tea in an airport cafe, his spokeswoman Kira Yarmish said. We reckon he was poisoned and that it happened with the tea. Obviously, authorities have their own ideas about when the situation is dangerous and when they need to neutralise Alexei. Alexei Navalny is one of Vladimir Putin's most vocal critics. He made a name for himself exposing corruption and he has a big internet following. He's also been jailed several times and was barred from running in the 2018 election due to a fraud conviction he says was politically motivated. Dr. Nikolai Petrov is a senior research fellow at Chatham House.
Navalny is a very brave man, and he has been attacked several times, including being poisoned about a year ago when he was put behind the bars.
If Alexei Navalny was poisoned, he's by no means the first critic of the Kremlin to meet that fate. Notable examples include former spy Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia in the UK city of Salisbury in 2018, and Russian defector Alexander Litvinenko, who died of radiation poisoning in London back in 2006.
This is what they do. They go after their enemies with poison.
Bill Browder is a financier and anti-corruption activist and a long-time critic of Vladimir Putin.
You have a whole string of poisoning of enemies. So on one side of their mouth, they can say, don't shoot to other people, don't ever think about doing that again. On the other side of their mouth, they can say, we had nothing to do with it. And it's very difficult to prove.
Moscow vehemently denies settling scores using poison, and a spokesman has wished Mr Navalny a speedy recovery.
Nick Dole reporting there. The country's top netballers and their fans have waited several months for a grand final and they will get their wish on Sunday. But COVID-19 has meant things will be a little bit different. The Tactics have booked their first ever ANZ Premiership grand final appearance and will take on the defending champions, the Pulse. The Tactics are based in Canterbury and the Pulse in Wellington. Yet the final is being played in Invercargill. Sports reporter Bridget Tunnicliffe is in the Deep South and explains.
COVID-19 brought the ANZ Premiership to a screaming halt in March after only one round had been played. Players from all 6 franchises worked hard to maintain their fitness during lockdown, so they were ready for when the competition resumed. Tactics shooter Tapaya Selby-Ricketts says if you include pre-season training, it has been a 10-month journey, which has been a challenge physically.
There's a few of us now, our bodies are just holding together, just a couple of wee niggles that we're trying to stay on top of, but that's just fatigue. It has been a long season. We started in early November last year and obviously trained right through lockdown and things like that. So, yeah, the bodies are pretty tired, but we're managing it and we'll be firing to go on Sunday.
Because of the financial impacts of the pandemic, the Tactics franchise had to go into voluntary liquidation and Netball New Zealand stepped in to support them. Tactics coach Marianne Delaney-Hoshek lost all her support staff, including her assistant coach, but says it hasn't affected their on-court performance.
We sort of knew once we got it all together we'd be amazing. But it just took a little bit of work to get to that time, and I guess we knew we had to win those last games, so it's, sometimes when your back's against the wall you do the best thing. So yeah, it's been really cool to see how much progress the girls have made.
The experienced Pulse will be looking to farewell their outgoing coach Yvette McCausland-Dury with back-to-back titles. The league leaders will go in as favourites, but McCausland-Dury says they will be wary of the fast-improving Tactics.
We've watched them continue to build throughout the rounds, so we think they've got huge potential everywhere. We equally have to be really confident in our group. We've been together a while. This is the 4th time a number of us have been in a grand final, and we've got to use that experience wisely.
When the Premiership restarted in June, the first 6 rounds were played in Auckland, as organisers thought a single venue would work better if COVID-19 resurfaced. Home and away games returned for the back half of the season, and Invercargill was picked for the playoffs with a view to rewarding Southern Steel players and fans who had very few home games. But with crowds not allowed now under Level 2 restrictions, those fans won't get to be in the stands this weekend. Pulse player Kelly Dury will have some support at the game, but it's taking quite an effort.
My in-laws and my boyfriend are coming down. Their flight out of Auckland got cancelled, and obviously with Auckland the way it is, they can't get in, so they're actually driving down to Wellington and flying out from there, from Morrinsville. So it's a long trip for them, but they're really excited.
McCausland jury admits it's been an odd build-up, but after the delays at the start of the season and the second COVID-19 outbreak threatening to derail the final, she's relieved it's going ahead.
A grand final's a grand final, and we've got to get up for it and make sure that we make the most of it, because it's a huge privilege, one, to make it, and two, to be given the opportunity that we've played a whole, season of ANZ Premiership despite the changes to it. It's huge, and we want to make sure we finish well.
The game starts at 6:45 on Sunday in Invercargill. For Checkpoint Court, Bridget Tunnicliffe-Tine.
Some feedback now on the Christchurch DHB. This person says it's actually the best performing one in the country, even in the face of multiple severe challenges over the last decade and systemic underfinancing when per capita funding is increasingly falling behind the national average. It is partly political in that the board leant very rightward and confrontational with several new appointments after the last election. David Mates is the kind of leader any organisation would be truly blessed to have. It is a great shame he and others have felt the need to go. I fear for the well-being of staff who are already fragile, says Andrew. On the North-South rugby game, and I need to get the tone of this right, for goodness sake, it's just grown men running around a field chasing a leather bag. Please, is it really essential for the betterment of New Zealand?
RNZ News at 6. Ngā mihi nui ko Susana Lei Atawa tēnei. The country's biggest city has been in lockdown for 10 days, and that won't change this weekend. The Prime Minister and Cabinet reviewed the Alert Level 3 restrictions for Auckland today, but a decision won't be made about any changes until Monday. Here's political reporter Joe Moyer.
The Director-General of Health says he will be looking at the pattern of new cases when he gives his advice to Cabinet on Monday. Today there were 11 new cases of COVID-19, 9 of them in the community and all with links to the current cluster. Dr Ashley Bloomfield says even if there are multiple new cases over the weekend, that wouldn't rule out Auckland moving down alert levels. Jacinda Ardern isn't ruling anything in or out, except to say any changes will be for all of Auckland and not on a suburb-by-suburb basis. From Parliament, Joe Moyer.
The Auckland City Mission says it's handing out 1,200 food parcels a week, with demand ramping back up to levels seen during the first COVID-19 lockdown. City Missioner Chris Farrelly told Checkpoint more people have lost their jobs, and families that were already struggling have been finding it even harder since Auckland's move back into Alert Level 3. The number of food parcels they're handing out is 3 times what they were doing in a normal week before the pandemic. Mr Farrelly expects they will be dealing with high levels of demand for many months to come. Victoria has recorded its lowest number of new coronavirus cases in more than 5 weeks. For the first time since July the 13th, fewer than 200 daily cases have been recorded, furthering hopes that strict lockdown rules may soon be eased in Melbourne. The Victorian Premier, Daniel Andrews, says the trend gives him cause for hope.
We are all pleased to see a 1 in front of these additional case numbers, and to a certain extent it is perhaps at that level a little quicker than I thought that it might be. Of course, this Sunday marks the 3 weeks since the most significant of the workplace restrictions came into effect. To be at this point shows that the strategy is working.
Yet Daniel Andrews says it's far too early to begin discussing lifting lockdown restrictions in Melbourne. Victoria has now tested more than 2 million people for the virus. The Prime Minister says the government is trying to resolve tensions between Canterbury District Health Board's clinicians and board members before healthcare is impacted. 7 members of the board's executive team have resigned since July, with one speaking out today and citing the adversarial attitude of the board as her reason for leaving. The Health Minister spoke to the board chair, Sir John Hanson, today. Jacinda Ardern says the government knows it needs to move quickly.
It is fair to say that we are working very hard to play a constructive role in the dispute and the tension that obviously exists within the DHB. And we do have a role to play there. The Minister has been very, very active in trying to help resolve some of those issues.
Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. Age Concern says it's too early to say if elderly suicides are on an upward trend, but the rise in deaths last year is concerning. The The latest statistics on suicide released today show the overall suicide rate is down, but the elderly rate increased sharply. Honi Naus, an advisor for elder abuse and neglect prevention at Age Concern, says more often older people are experiencing their partners and peers dying. Ms Naus says the sense of change in livelihoods is a repeating pattern that older people are confronted with much more regularly. A Taranaki farmer says the province's biggest roading project in generations will create an ecological disaster if allowed to progress. Tony Pascoe has lived his entire life in the Mangapepeke Valley, but now the $200 million Mount Messenger bypass plans loom large. Mr Pascoe is appealing interim consents for the project granted in the Environment Court.
This is my life, but it's not just my life. I'm fighting for our children and other people's children and the generations behind us and in front of us.
Mr Pascoe wants the valley, which includes large tracts of native forest and wetland, turned into a reserve. The Transport Agency says the route is the least ecologically damaging and will improve road safety. It says a comprehensive mitigation and ongoing pest control program will enhance biodiversity in the area. Ngāti Tama and the Department of Conservation are also supporting the project. The High Court appeal begins next week. The US President Donald Trump's former chief strategist, Steve Bannon, has pleaded not guilty to defrauding a private fundraising campaign. A multi-million-dollar bond has been approved and the judge has approved bail for Mr Bannon. With more on the charges, here's the BBC's Barbara Pletasher.
We Build the Wall was a private fundraising project, a GoFundMe project online that was set up by Steve Bannon and his associates to build a segment of the wall along the southern border with Mexico. And they raised $25 million that way, and they promised donors that this money would all go towards that project. But according to the indictment, a lot of it didn't go to that project. It went to them instead, and that Mr. Bannon himself diverted $1 million, using some of it to cover his personal expenses.
Barbara Pletasher in Washington. It's 5.5 minutes past 6. New Zealand Rugby doesn't want to play the North-South game without the Auckland-based players. The game has been postponed until September 5th due to the COVID-19 alert levels preventing players and support staff from leaving Auckland. NZR's Chris Lendrum says the government has turned down their request for travel exemptions once, but they'll try again if they need to.
For business exemptions, the threshold is very, very high, and we haven't met the threshold, which is, it's frustrating for everybody involved in the game and the fans, but we totally accept the decision.
Chris Lendrum. New Zealand golfer Lydia Coe will tee off shortly before 7 p.m. New Zealand time on day 2 of the British Women's Open in Scotland. Coe will start the second round 5 shots off the lead, but in a tie for 14th place at the testing Royal Troon course.
It's tough because you're not hitting a lot of full shots and you don't see as many birdies as some of the other tournaments, so patience is going to be a big key around here.
Lydia Coe. The video assistant referee system will be reintroduced for the A-League football finals. The VAR was used for the majority of the season but has not been used since the competition restarted. The Phoenix play Perth Glory tomorrow night in the elimination final. Brendan Hartley is the only New Zealand driver confirmed so far for next month's Le Mans 24-hour motor race. New Zealander Earl Bamber, who's won the event twice, isn't on the entry list after Porsche withdrew their top cars because of the economic impact of the COVID-19 crisis. That's the news.
Take the pulse of the day's news every weeknight at 10.
We have 600 West Home members, but by and large I'm confident that all our membership are doing the right thing.
Lately with me, Karen Hay, is your late night eye on the latest headlines and the people who are making them.
If you are the lady who rebound and returned a book to the Wellington Library, you, mate, are an absolute legend and a very cool human.
Up to date if you're up late. Lately with Karen Hay every weeknight from 10 on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland to Kapiti, Central High Country. Territory, Coromandel Peninsula and Bay of Plenty. Showers and fine breaks, squally thunderstorms, hail possible until tonight, showers clearing tomorrow, returning to Northland and Auckland from tomorrow afternoon. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay fine and warm, Wellington, Wairarapa and Marlborough a few showers clearing tomorrow and fine spells increasing. Nelson fine spells, occasional showers and possible thunderstorms mostly about the Western Ranges clearing tomorrow. Bulla and Westland rain mostly north of the glaciers with heavy falls and thunderstorms possible, easing to a few showers from tonight, clearing tomorrow. Canterbury, Otago and Southland fine breaks inland, low cloud about the coast, patchy drizzle tonight, isolated showers tomorrow afternoon. Fiordland, cloudy periods and a few showers. Chatham Islands, a few showers, clearing later tomorrow. RNZ National, it's 6:08
Thanks, Susanna. If you're just joining us, this is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. The Transport Agency has been forced to fork out another $208 million to get Wellington's billion-dollar highway transmission gully back on track. The road has now blown the budget by more than $400 million. It was initially set to cost $850 million, but now has a $1.25 billion price tag for the taxpayer. And now the Transport Minister has ordered a review and is questioning the agreement drawn up by the previous government. Charlotte Cook has been following the story.
NZTA is coughing up $145.5 million to the builder, $12.5 million to the contractor, and around $5 million to the maintenance contractor. The agency's General Manager of Transport Services, Brett Glidden, says the COVID-19 pandemic triggered months of negotiations.
The pandemic was what we call a force majeure event under the PPPs. So that basically means that it was identified, but there wasn't an expectation that the contractor had to allow for that when they bid the work. So that means that under the contract it's noted, but then if it happens, which it did, it becomes what's called an uninsurable event, and that sets some mechanisms off in the contract to require the parties to negotiate the impacts of that.
He says the lockdown caused significant delays to the construction plans, but he's confident the road will be open to users in September next year, just not officially completed.
What you'll see on the 27th of September is a 4-lane motorway, open with barriers and with lights where that applies, and as far as when you drive it, it will just look and feel like a motorway. What you might still see happening over the following 6 months is guys and girls planting, landscaping. You might see diggers working on streams and tidying up all the auxiliary works off to the side of the motorway.
Mr Glidden says it's been a big job to rejig the workforce around COVID's international restrictions.
We had about 130 people from overseas working on the project. This did have a big impact from an overseas perspective. That meant that not only did we have to negotiate the impact of that, but we've also had to look at the methodology about how we build the job, because we're now going to have to do it with New Zealand workforce.
The government has announced the Infrastructure Commission will oversee an urgent and wide-ranging review into the Transmission Gully project. The Transport Minister, Phil Twyford, says construction has been plagued with delays and increased costs, and the original agreement appears to have been rushed through without the necessary due diligence being carried out by the former government.
When you look at a 1.5-year delay and a $400 million overrun, you have to ask whether or not that contract was drafted properly and whether they anticipated the risks. Notwithstanding COVID and the delays, I just think that kind of outcome is unacceptable. It's unacceptable to the taxpayer. It's disappointment for the people of the Wellington region. Governments need to be better than that.
He says Wellingtonians and taxpayers deserve to know exactly what happened. In Wellington for Checkpoint, Charlotte Cook.
Test results have confirmed a COVID-positive retail worker at St Luke's Mall is linked to the main Auckland cluster, ruling out fears of another strain in circulation in the community. Health officials say the man may have picked up the virus on a bus, which means other passengers may have also been exposed. Ruth Hill reports.
Genome sequencing by ESR has found the retail worker, who worked at the mall for several days while infectious, does have the same strain as the main cluster. The Director General of Health, Dr Ashley Bloomfield, says they're still trying to work out exactly how we caught it.
One specific line of inquiry is that this case and another case may have been on the same bus. And I'd like to take the opportunity to remind everybody of the value of and the importance of using masks when in places particularly like public transport, where it is difficult to maintain physical distancing.
Auckland Regional Public Health is working with Auckland Transport to use Hopcard data to identify other passengers on the same bus on the morning of August the 12th. They will be treated like close contacts, and the system of contact tracing, isolation and testing will kick in. Dr Bloomfield said the timing is fortunate because it was just before Level 3 restrictions came in.
That's the value of having that wider restriction on movement, is that even if there were people who may have been on that bus and may have been exposed and or infected, that they haven't been out and about in the community near as much as they might have been if we were in an alert level 1 or 2.
All but one of the 89 cases in the community are now linked to the cluster. Health authorities are still investigating the possibility that a Ridges Hotel maintenance worker caught the coronavirus from a lift. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern said that standalone case shows how tricky the virus is, but it also shows how the system should work.
We can't stop every case, but we can stop cases spreading. If this Ridges case happened on its own without our current cluster, we would not have needed to increase any restrictions for Auckland or the rest of the country. In situations like this, we can manage COVID with the protocols we have. That needs to, of course, be our goal for the future.
There are 11 cases of COVID-19 today, 9 in the community and 2 in managed isolation facilities. Ms Ardern said the government is confident the outer limits of the cluster have been identified, with most cases diagnosed in people who were already in isolation because they had previously been identified as close contacts. She noted that over the last 10 days, health authorities have found cases connected with 2 shopping malls, 6 schools and 4 churches.
Imagine how much bigger that cluster and outbreak would be if all of those places hadn't closed and that contact had continued, if school students had continued to mingle, if shop workers continued to serve people. It could have been enormous. So for that, I want to say thank you, Auckland. You have made a huge difference to our containment efforts.
The Prime Minister said thousands of masks are being distributed through community organisations and commended the many New Zealanders who have been making their own. Dr Bloomfield was able to produce one example from his own pocket, made by his son's friend's mother, and generously agreed to model the correct way to put it on.
This is always a little dangerous to do, of course,
I think
in
that's
front of a live
TV
audience. That's exactly right. So the important thing here is to, of course, hold the elastic at the ends and keep the hands away from the mouth and face. It goes here over the ears. In my case, not too difficult to do. The one problem I do have is my glasses do fog up a bit, you will notice, and I'll take that off. Apparently you can use sellotape across the top just to help prevent that. So.
The total number of confirmed cases of COVID-19 is now 1,315, including 105 that are active. 8 people are in hospital, 2 in Auckland City, 1 in North Shore Hospital and 5 in Middlemore Hospital, including 1 in intensive care. For Checkpoint, Ruth Hill.
A Taranaki couple is vowing to fight to the bitter end to stay in their home, which is in the path of the province's biggest roading project in generations. Tony Pascoe has lived his entire life in Mangapepeke Valley. He and his wife Debbie raised their children there, but now the $200 million Mount Messenger bypass project looms large. Our Taranaki Whanganui reporter Robin Martin went to visit the Mangapepeke Valley.
Nestled at the northern entrance to Mount Messenger is 3072 Morco Road, a modest weatherboard dwelling surrounded by the detritus of decades of farm life. It's home to Tony and Debbie Pascoe. Beyond the chooks and dog kennels lies the Mangapepeke Valley, kilometres of wetlands surrounded on each side by native bush, some of it hundreds of years old. Tony Pascoe, who runs a few beef cattle here, can't believe it's been chosen as the new route for State Highway 3.
You've got your kaikateas, your rewaweras, your five-finger, your whitey woods. There's something like 70 varieties of different native orchid in here. I'm not up to play with all these sorts of trees in here, but there's a huge amount. There's some back here that the people just go, wow, there's not many of these around.
Not to mention the bird life.
Well, there's 23 species of native birds, they're saying, and I've seen most of them over the years. There's your long-tailed bat, the creek's full of eels and crayfish and native fish. and this valley is full of kiwis. Just beside that tree there the other night, there was a kiwi going for it. One over the valley going for it. One back over there going for it. Two back at home going for it.
The Transport Agency says the route, chosen from a short list of 5, avoids the ecologically sensitive Waipinao Valley and a large landslide to the north of Mount Messenger, which affects the current main road north out of Taranaki. The agency says it will enhance the road's safety, resilience and reliability and will contribute to regional economic growth. The 6-kilometre bypass, which includes 2 bridges and a 235-metre tunnel, will also be 4 to 5 minutes quicker than the existing route. That's not good enough for Marie Gibbs of the Potama Kaitiaki Charitable Trust, which is supporting the Pascoes in their High Court challenge to interim consents granted by the Environment Court.
Tony and Debbie and Potama are here to protect this land and protect this valley. We don't want the road to go up here, but if it must go up here, we want as little damage done as possible.
She reckons tweaks could have been made to the existing road.
There's some alterations they can make to that route to make it less expensive and to make it a really good option, good road, make a bigger tunnel, bypass that top windy section. We don't need a 100k road over the mountain. If we got an 80k road over there, it'd be great.
But the Transport Agency has already cut a deal with Ngāti Tama, the iwi whose rohe the road passes over. It's swapping 20 hectares needed for the bypass for a 120-hectare parcel that will give it better access to a block of treaty settlement land. The deal also includes a $7.7 million mitigation and compensation payment and an ongoing pest management scheme. The Department of Conservation, which originally submitted against the route, is also now on board. It says while there will be a loss of flora and fauna near the road, it believes the mitigation package will address this loss and over time significantly enhance the biodiversity of other nearby areas. Tony Pascoe, who'd like to see the land turned into a reserve, doesn't buy that.
It'll kill the valley. It'll kill the wildlife. All the wetlands will be stuffed. It'll just annihilate them. You can't put 150, 200, 300 machines in here with all the oil and the diesel and 150, 200 people and utes and the eels, the crayfish, the big cockapoo fish and that sort of stuff, native fish. They'll have nowhere to hide.
The Pascoes have been offered $660,000, an 11-hectare parcel of land on Mount Messenger, and an unspecified contribution to a new home. But walking away is not something Debbie Pascoe wants to even imagine.
When you love something as much as we love the bush and being here, you can't walk right away from it. It's going to be a very, very hard day, and I hope it never ever happens.
And for Tony, it's just not about the money.
When they come and slam their hand on our table, a couple of days before the 1st September 2007, when they said, you won't be able to live in your house, and I said, this is our home, where we're going to live, and they said, we don't know. And the property group fellas told me 2 or 3 times since, your home is worth nothing. It is our home. A lot of people come to our home. A lot of people come back this valley and think, wow, you are so lucky, Tony, to have this.
The High Court will begin hearing appeals against the interim consents in New Plymouth on Monday. I Taranaki mo te hōtaka o te ahipo nei, ko Robin Martinaho.
Almost 1 out of every 10 New Zealanders is living with the risk of a tsunami. New research conducted by the National Institute for Water and Atmospheric Research, or NIWA, has revealed both the population and the critical infrastructure located in tsunami evacuation zones. NIWA wants the information to be used by civil defence in planning for an emergency. Harry Locke reports.
The new report shows 430,000 people live within a tsunami evacuation zone. That's just shy of 10% of the entire population. The NIWA study outlines how 6,300 kilometres of road would be hit, along with nearly 9,000 critical buildings. That means hospitals, government offices and emergency response buildings. Included in that are 200 medical buildings, over 1,000 schools and 23 airports. One of the report's authors, hazard analyst Ryan Paulick, says he hopes the information will help emergency planning.
It enables us to identify
where people are located and in what types of buildings or facilities. That information can be used for preparing populations, so it can target those who are most critically vulnerable to adverse consequences during a tsunami event.
Of those who live within an evacuation zone, 150,000 are children or considered elderly. Mr. Paulick says that's important to understand.
Those age groups are most vulnerable to harm in tsunami events, so safe evacuation of those populations is critical for preserving life during a tsunami event.
In total, tsunami evacuation zones cover an area of more than 2,700 kilometres squared. The National Emergency Management Agency is responsible for preparing and responding to events such as a major tsunami. In a statement voiced by RNZ, the Director of the Civil Defence, Sarah Stewart-Black, says the information could go a long way.
By providing a detailed picture of the people and infrastructure within tsunami evacuation zones, the national assessment data will contribute to the body of research that informs response and recovery planning and risk reduction activities.
The research should help regional councils, who oversee many of the local emergency management groups. Hawke's Bay is an area particularly at risk, with 13,000 people living in tsunami evacuation zones and with the Hikurangi subduction zone directly off the coast. The region's Emergency Management General Manager Ian MacDonald also said in a statement that the work will complement their own.
This NIWA study helps us build a clearer picture of our tsunami risk. We know a tsunami of some size in the future is certain. The national assessment will support the recently released Hikurangi Response Planning Toolbox, which has been designed to support regional and national planning for a Hikurangi subduction zone, earthquake and tsunami.
NIWA's Ryan Paulick says while this report details New Zealand's exposure to a tsunami, there's still more work to be done.
The next steps would be to try and quantify what the impacts are from tsunami to the buildings, infrastructure and people that reside within evacuation zones.
Civil Defence is promoting a catchy phrase so people know what to do if an earthquake hits and are in a tsunami zone. If long and strong, get gone. For Checkpoint, Harry Locke.
It's 25 minutes past 6 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. More than 300,000 people watched on from the stands when Scott Dixon was victorious in one of World Motorsport's 3 premier races in 2008. But if the Kiwi driver is to win a second Indianapolis 500 title next week, those very same stands will be deserted. Clay Wilson caught up with Scott Dixon ahead of Monday morning's big race and asked the 5-time IndyCar champ about racing in an empty stadium.
It's normally the month of May, and now we're starting the Indianapolis 500 in August, so that's a big change. But the city of Indianapolis kind of feels a bit normal in the fact, there's checkered flags and, signs and all that kind of stuff out on people's front lawns, and they're embracing it. But obviously the sheer size of this venue that seats over 300,000 people with nobody in the seats looks, drastically different. So it's definitely a different lead up, but what's normal right now, I think that's the toughest part.
What are the restrictions like for you guys on track? How much different is it in terms of the normal things you go about?
Yeah, there's no real interaction, the track is shut down totally. Just, essential personnel as far as the teams. Each entrant, I think, is allowed up to 20 people per car. Even the way we do the trucks, typically we would have, 60 to 80 people with 3 cars. And, all our trucks kind of line up together with, 6 or 7 of them, whereas now we're only allowed 5 people in each truck. Everybody's got to wear face coverings. The health checks are done every day. You have rapid testing sites in the actual circuit if need be. So the restrictions are pretty tight. Even typical team debriefs are kind of the toughest. You either have to be in a very big room where you can accommodate, more people that are social distance, and then you're even in between screens and cubes at that point. So a lot of it is being done virtually, whether it's team meetings or even engineering meetings. So it's kind of hard to have that personal touch, and even the same with, travel for us or food or, it's very contained.
You've raced in front of a few empty tracks already, but this race is so well known for that atmosphere created by that crowd. Are you expecting it to be like on race day without anyone in the stands?
Yeah, it's going to be pretty dramatic. There's no circuit, I think, or really any venue that goes through this transformation. I think from weeks leading up, even when we have qualifying, we typically have 80 to 100,000 people, and it looks kind of empty, So to have absolutely nobody is going to look very, very surreal and a bit strange. But, the end result is the same thing, right? As you commented, we've had several races already this year. It did feel oddly strange to be in victory lane and celebrating, and it's just really yourself and maybe one other person, trying to, spray champagne.
And just in terms of the race, obviously starting from second looks pretty good, but in such a long and tough race, how much difference does it make to be at the front of the grid?
Yeah, there's a couple of big things about it. I think, in all honesty, you kind of want to have a boring day. You kind of want to have no trouble. You don't want to be caught in anything. And I think when you qualify like last year, I think it was my worst qualifying position ever for the 500 and 18th. And you just open yourself up to people making mistakes or courting in effect to, pit selection. When you get into the meat of the pack, especially on pit road, Indianapolis pit lanes, it's also very narrow. And when you get two cars side by side and you try to add a third, it's almost impossible. And we've seen many times in the past that has taken, clear race winners or people that could fight for a race win out of the race. So, yeah, if you can start near the front, that's where you want to be, man.
Yeah, just on that, I mean, you're obviously desperate to win this race every year. But with every year that goes past that you don't win it again, does that grow just a little bit more?
Yeah, the drive to get a first win here is immense. But then, the feeling and gratification and almost relief that you get from winning it, being on that short list of less than, 70 people that have ever had, the opportunity to win. But it's just like a driving force that keeps pushing you forward. And yeah, I'm probably more towards the end of racing at the Indy 500 than I was at the start of it. So definitely each year just builds on each other.
And that was Scott Dixon there speaking to Clay Wilson. And the Indy 500 starts at 6:30 on Monday morning New Zealand time. So you'll be able to bail out of bed in your gym jams and watch that. Some feedback before we head off, all of it on COVID, on farmers whose properties and stock straddle the border around Auckland. Sarah says, as farmers, we truly feel for farmers trapped by the borders, and the government, even the opposition, media and police have no idea what this means for stock. Marianne's got in touch. She's not impressed with the government's containment of this outbreak of COVID-19. She says the government has wasted 100 days we had free of community transmission. They should have been much more proactive in ensuring COVID test numbers were high and that the COVID app had high take-up. Also, they should have ensured border testing was happening. The Prime Minister's trying to shift responsibility, but the blame lies with them. And this one, wow, these police roadblocks don't work. Friday night and selfish Aucklanders are heading for the weekend batch. Back Monday.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. The Auckland City Mission is handing out 1,200 food parcels a week, 3 times the number they were handing out in a normal week before the pandemic. Cabinet will make a decision about whether to lower the country's alert levels on Monday. Victoria has recorded 179 new coronavirus cases today, its lowest figure in more than 5 weeks. The Prime Minister says the government has a role intervening in the Canterbury District House Board dispute after a mass exodus of senior staff. Our next news and weather is at 7. This is Trending Now, our feature highlighting the stories you've been sharing via digital and social media ahead of this week's edition of Focus on Politics. Meghan Markle is often portrayed as the woman who took Harry out of the royal family, but the co-author of